They were told Americans would torture them, starve them, strip them of every shred of dignity until they begged for death. But when Japanese prisoners of war stepped into Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, in the winter of 1944, the enemy broke them, not with violence, but with hamburgers and Coca-Cola. They expected cruelty. They braced for the end. What they got instead was something far more disorienting: kindness. And that kindness would haunt them far longer than any beating ever could. When the train doors clattered open in the biting Wisconsin cold of December 1944, dozens of Japanese soldiers stepped down onto snow-packed ground, blinking against pale winter light that felt almost alien after months in the Pacific heat. Their uniforms hung in tatters, some held together with thread or strips of torn cloth. Hunger had carved their faces into hollow masks, sunken cheeks, tired eyes rimmed with dark circles, lips cracked and bleeding from weeks of short rations and brutal transport. Each man had been taught the same unshakable lesson since his first day in the Imperial Army: capture was shame. Capture was worse than death itself. They had been warned in training camps, in barracks, in whispered conversations before battle. The Americans, their officers said, would torture them, starve them, humiliate them until they begged for mercy that would never come. Many of these men had prepared themselves mentally to be struck down the moment they left the train. Some had even whispered final prayers, saying goodbye to ancestors they believed they would soon join. But instead, what greeted them made them hesitate, confusion flickering across exhausted faces. Rows of wooden barracks stood against the snow, sturdy and orderly. Guard towers rose at intervals, barbed wire glinting under pale sunlight. A few sentries stood with rifles slung across their shoulders, watching the new arrivals with expressions that were firm but not savage. The atmosphere was not what they had pictured. There was order here, a kind of quiet routine that felt almost surreal. Trucks passed through camp roads, engines rumbling low. Smoke rose from kitchen chimneys, carrying a smell that made stomachs clench involuntarily. Cooking food, rich food, far stronger and heartier than the weak soups and watery rice they had lived on for months. Some of the prisoners exchanged nervous glances, eyes darting to one another as if searching for confirmation that this was real. Others kept their eyes low, unwilling to betray even a spark of curiosity or hope. Guards shouted commands in English, voices crisp and fast. The prisoners did not understand most of the words, but the tone was firm, professional, not filled with the rage they expected. Interpreters stepped forward, their voices carrying over the cold air. Line up. Move forward. Do not break formation. Then something even stranger appeared. Red Cross officials stood at the sidelines, clipboards in hand, observing the intake process with careful eyes. That presence alone startled many of the prisoners. Back home, they had been told that America was lawless, brutal, indifferent to international treaties and humanitarian rules. Yet here were neutral outsiders, representatives of an international organization, ensuring that procedures were being followed. Could this be real? Or was this part of some elaborate psychological trap designed to lower their defenses before the real horrors began? The intake process was mechanical, but shocking in its humanity. Men were led into processing buildings where they were deloused, their lice-infested uniforms stripped away and burned in metal drums. Medical checks were carried out methodically, doctors and medics measuring fever, checking for malnutrition, inspecting broken bones and infected wounds. One Japanese soldier with a bandaged arm, the cloth stained brown with old blood, expected to be ignored or shoved aside. Instead, an American medic carefully unwrapped the dirty bandage, inspected the wound with a clinical eye, cleaned it with antiseptic that stung sharply, and dressed it again with fresh white gauze. The soldier sat frozen on the examination table, unable to reconcile the act of care with the image of the barbaric enemy that had been drilled into him since childhood. His hands trembled slightly as the medic tied off the bandage and gestured for him to move along. One prisoner whispered to another in rapid, disbelieving Japanese, "Why would they do this? We are not their men. We are nothing to them." His companion shook his head slowly, eyes still wide with confusion. "It must be a trick. Wait. The punishment will come." The fear lingered like smoke, hanging over every step they took. Every moment felt like it might lead to the cruelty they had been promised, the degradation they had been taught to expect. Yet each hour revealed something stranger, an unexpected adherence to rules, to procedures, to something the interpreters called the Geneva Convention. That phrase had been whispered before, passed around in hushed conversations among prisoners on transport ships, but none of them had truly believed it would carry weight. Rules? For prisoners? It seemed absurd, almost insulting in its impossibility. After registration, the men were marched across the yard toward their new quarters. Snow crunched under their boots, the cold cutting through their thin coats like knives. But the barracks, though rough and clearly military in nature, were heated. Stoves glowed in corners, radiating warmth that felt like a distant memory. The bunks were lined up in rows, each with a thin mattress and wool blankets folded at the foot. It was not home. It was not freedom. But it was shelter. A few prisoners sat heavily on the mattresses, hands pressing into the fabric as if testing whether the softness would vanish like a dream. The bunks were hard, yes, but they were beds. Real beds. Not dirt floors or bamboo mats crawling with insects. One man ran his hand over the wool blanket, feeling the rough texture between his fingers, and something broke inside him. Not audibly, but quietly, deep in his chest. Barbed wire still surrounded them, a constant reminder that this was captivity. Yet inside these walls, the men noticed something they could not ignore. The camp was run like a machine, yes, but not like a dungeon. The contrast gnawed at them. All their lives, they had been told that capture meant degradation. That surrender stripped a man of his honor, reducing him to something less than an animal in the eyes of the enemy. But here, at Camp McCoy, the first images that imprinted themselves on their minds were disturbingly different. A guard helping a sick man steady himself as he stumbled on icy ground. A medic carefully wrapping gauze around a stranger's wound. A Red Cross representative checking that rations were being distributed fairly, marking notes on a clipboard with methodical precision. The men did not relax. Not yet. Suspicion lived in their chests like a second heartbeat, pulsing with every breath. But as night came, and they lay on cots under real blankets, staring up at wooden rafters instead of jungle canopies or cave ceilings, they could not help but wonder. The greatest shock, they realized, was not captivity itself. It was how captivity looked nothing like the nightmare they had braced for. But the true shock, the moment that would shatter assumptions and rewrite their understanding of the enemy, would not come with rules or barracks or medical care. It would come on a tray in the mess hall, carried by the smell of meat and the hiss of soda bottles waiting to be opened. The next morning, the prisoners woke not to blows or shouted insults, but to a bugle call. The sound startled many of them, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. They had heard the same sound in their own camps back in Japan, the same military rhythm that structured every soldier's day. For a moment, some forgot where they were. But then reality came rushing back with the clank of boots outside and English voices barking orders in the cold morning air. They were ordered into formation, names called out in butchered Japanese pronunciation, then directed toward the mess hall. The fear of what might come next sat heavy in their chests like stones. Many expected that food would be withheld, or that they would be fed scraps unfit for animals, rotten vegetables, moldy bread, perhaps nothing at all. Hunger had been their constant companion in the Pacific. Meals had dwindled over the months to bowls of watery rice, sometimes mixed with barley if they were lucky, and occasionally a few pickled vegetables that barely qualified as nutrition. Meat was a rarity, something reserved for officers or special occasions. Sugar was almost mythical. But before food, there were procedures. The prisoners were gathered in a large room where a Red Cross representative addressed them through an interpreter, his voice calm and official. He explained their rights under the Geneva Convention. They would be fed, housed, allowed to write letters home. They would work, but only under certain conditions. No forced labor, no abuse. They would not be subjected to violence or humiliation. They would be visited regularly by neutral officials to ensure these rules were being respected. The words were met with disbelief. Some men lowered their eyes, ashamed that they were hearing this, that they had been captured at all. Others whispered among themselves, voices tight with skepticism. One soldier muttered to his friend, barely audible, "They speak of rights, but we are their captives. Why would they bother with any of this?" The interpreter paused, allowing the murmurs to settle before continuing. "These are not promises," he said slowly, letting each word sink in. "These are rules. For you, yes, but for them, they are binding. They must follow them." The weight of those words hung in the cold air like frost. After that came more medical checks, more thorough than the day before. Doctors pressed fingers into thin wrists, checking pulses. They examined teeth, measured blood pressure with equipment the prisoners had never seen up close. Men were weighed, and many came in dangerously underweight. Some Americans shook their heads quietly at the numbers, exchanging glances that spoke of concern rather than contempt. Malnutrition was obvious in every hollow face, every protruding rib. Yet no one mocked them. No one spat at them or called them weak. A corporal even handed out vitamins, small, chalky tablets that puzzled the men. Medicine? For enemies? It was almost insulting in its kindness, as if their captors could not grasp the magnitude of what it meant to be captured, to have failed their emperor, to be alive when honor demanded death. By the afternoon, they were given fresh clothes, plain, serviceable uniforms marked with large PW letters on the back. Prisoner of war. The garments fit better than the torn remnants they had worn from the field, and they were clean, free of lice and the stench of sweat and fear. Some prisoners slipped into the new uniforms slowly, hesitating with each button as though every stitch was a surrender of identity. Others embraced the warmth immediately, shivering less as the Wisconsin wind pushed through the cracks in the barracks walls. The guards themselves were another surprise. Yes, they were armed. Yes, they were strict and watchful. But they did not spit on the prisoners or strike them for moving too slowly. They enforced order without cruelty. When one elderly prisoner stumbled on an icy path, his legs weak from months of malnutrition, a young guard reached down and pulled him up by the arm. No kick, no sneer. Just a curt nod before the guard walked on, rifle still slung over his shoulder. It was deeply confusing, this restraint, this lack of rage. That night, as the prisoners sat in their barracks, conversations ran low and heavy. Voices carried through the dim light, tinged with uncertainty. "Can you believe them?" one man asked, staring up at the ceiling beams. "They speak of rules as though this is some kind of arrangement. Do they not hate us?" Another replied quietly, "They must be pretending. To trap us. To make us speak. To break us slowly." And yet, when silence fell and the last whispers died away, the smell from the kitchens carried over again. It was thick, rich, fatty, not the sour, thin soups they knew from the islands, but something whole, something filling. Their stomachs growled involuntarily, betraying them. The Americans, it seemed, did not consider food to be a weapon. For them, it was routine, a Tuesday dinner, a Thursday lunch, nothing more. But for the Japanese prisoners who had marched half-dead through jungles and beaches, who had hidden in caves gnawing on roots and tree bark, who had surrendered with bellies hollow and skins stretched tight over bones, that smell was almost unbearable. Some pressed their faces into their blankets to block it out, trying to ignore the gnawing ache in their guts. Others whispered that tomorrow, perhaps, the trick would reveal itself. Perhaps the food was bait. Perhaps the kindness would vanish as quickly as it had appeared. Yet when the next day came, the lines formed again. The trays were filled again. The routine continued, steady and unshaken. The rules were real. The inspections were real. The procedures were real. And the strangest truth of all was slowly pressing itself against their expectations, undeniable and relentless. America, even in the middle of a brutal war, believed in order. But the order of rules was nothing compared to what waited in the mess hall itself, where hunger and memory would collide with a hamburger and a glass bottle they had never seen before. The line moved slowly, boots scraping against the mess hall floor. Steam rose from trays behind the counter, carrying a scent so foreign to Japanese noses that many of the men could not place it. At first, it was rich, heavy, smoky. Meat, yes, but not like the dried fish or tiny cuts of pork they had once eaten at home. This was thicker, heartier, something closer to luxury than sustenance. The prisoners clutched their tin trays like shields, waiting for the humiliation to come. Perhaps scraps would be thrown at them. Perhaps spoiled food would be ladled out with mockery and laughter. That was what they expected. Hunger made every second feel longer, stretching time into something agonizing. But fear held them back from looking too eager, from betraying the desperation that clawed at their insides. Then the first soldier stepped forward. An American cook, sleeves rolled to his elbows, forearms thick and covered in a light dusting of flour, dropped a hot patty onto a soft bun with a metal spatula. The sizzle echoed faintly. Then he added fried potatoes on the side, golden and glistening with grease. Finally, he reached for a glass bottle, its surface sweating with condensation, popped the cap with a quick twist, and slid it onto the tray. The red script on the label was unfamiliar, almost decorative, Coca-Cola. The Japanese soldier stared at the tray as if it were a trick, as if the food might vanish the moment he touched it. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the edges of the metal tray. "Move along," the cook said flatly, already reaching for the next bun. The prisoner shuffled forward, still staring, unable to process what he was holding. Behind him, others leaned forward, craning their necks to glimpse what had been given. Whispers rippled down the line like wildfire. "Meat. They're giving us meat." When more trays began to fill, disbelief deepened into something closer to shock. The bun was soft to the touch, still warm from the grill. The potatoes were fried golden, crispy on the edges. And the bottle, Coca-Cola, a guard explained curtly when asked, fizzed as though alive, bubbles rising to the surface in a slow, hypnotic dance. In the corner of the mess hall, the prisoners sat at long wooden tables, setting down their trays with a carefulness that bordered on reverence. They eyed the food cautiously, almost suspiciously, like men who had stumbled into forbidden territory. A few brought the bottle to their lips first. The sweetness exploded on their tongues, overwhelming and sharp, followed immediately by the burn of carbonation in their throats. Some gagged, coughing violently from the shock of it. Others widened their eyes in astonishment, pulling the bottle away to stare at it as if it had attacked them. One man laughed, a sudden, uncontrolled burst that startled his neighbors and echoed through the hall. Another covered his mouth and lowered his head, shoulders shaking, caught somewhere between laughter and tears. A thin soldier, ribs visible even under his new uniform, lifted his hamburger with both hands as though it might fall apart if he wasn't careful. He sniffed it first, inhaling deeply, then bit down. Grease ran down his chin, hot and slick. He froze mid-chew, jaw working slowly as if each bite might vanish if he moved too quickly. Then he lowered his face, hiding the tears that welled up and spilled over, tracing lines down his gaunt cheeks. A bunkmate sitting beside him nudged him gently. "Are you all right?" The man swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "I had forgotten what fat tastes like." At another table, two prisoners debated in low, urgent voices. "They want to make us weak," one argued, leaning forward. "They fatten us so we forget our cause, so we lose our will to resist." His companion was quiet for a long moment before responding slowly, almost reluctantly. "Or, they simply eat like this every day." That idea was harder to swallow than the food itself. The mess hall filled with low sounds, chewing, the scrape of metal on trays, muffled laughter, an occasional sob quickly hidden behind a hand or turned face. For a group of men who had lived through the hunger of Guadalcanal, Saipan, and the failing supply lines of the home islands, the meal was more than nourishment. It was an assault on their assumptions, on everything they had been taught about the enemy and the war. One prisoner later whispered to his bunkmate, voice thick with confusion, that the sweetness of the Coca-Cola felt like a dream gone wrong. Too gentle, too soft to belong in the middle of a war. The Americans serving the food noticed nothing extraordinary. To them, it was routine. They ate the same hamburgers and fries, washed them down with the same bottles of Coke, and thought nothing of it. For the guards and cooks, feeding prisoners was simply procedure, another task on a long list. But for the prisoners themselves, it was as if they had crossed into another reality, one where the rules they understood no longer applied. What shook them most was not the abundance, though that was staggering. It was the normality of it all. The Americans were not celebrating. They were not taunting or gloating. This was not a feast meant to impress or humiliate. It was simply Tuesday dinner. That contrast hit harder than any insult could have. Here were men who had fought ferociously, who had been told that America was starving, decadent, on the brink of economic and moral collapse. Yet in captivity, behind barbed wire, they were eating better than they had as free soldiers of the empire. The shame was sharp, cutting deep into their pride. But the relief was sharper still. By the time trays were emptied and bottles stood drained on the tables, the prisoners sat back in silence. Some folded their hands as if in prayer, heads bowed. Others stared blankly at the wall, trying to process what had just happened, trying to reconcile the meal with the enemy they had been taught to fear. The mess hall guards called for order, ushering the men back toward their barracks. The prisoners filed out, still stunned, still whispering among themselves about what they had tasted. That night, lying on bunks under wool blankets, the memory of the hamburger and Coca-Cola stayed with them. Not just as food, but as proof. Proof that their enemy lived in a different world. One where sweetness could be wasted on prisoners. One where meat was so common it could be shaped into patties and handed out without a second thought. But food was only the beginning. Once the routines of daily life inside Camp McCoy took hold, the prisoners would face a new challenge. living with order, boredom, and moments of humanity that tested everything they thought they knew. The shock of that first meal lingered, but it did not erase the reality of captivity. Each morning, the prisoners of war at Camp McCoy woke to the sound of roll call. Boots crunched in the frost outside. Rifles pointed toward them from the towers above, silhouettes dark against pale winter skies. The barbed wire was always there, cutting across the horizon, reminding them that this life, no matter how different from what they expected, was still a prison. Inside the wire, routine ruled everything. After breakfast, prisoners were divided into groups. Some were assigned to shovel snow from camp roads, their breath misting in the cold air as they worked. Others were sent to cut wood, axes biting into frozen logs that cracked and splintered under the blows. Still others were taken to help on nearby farms under guard supervision, planting or harvesting depending on the season. The work was steady but not brutal. It surprised many of the men that they were not being used to the point of exhaustion, not worked until they collapsed. Instead, they were paid. Small wages in camp coupons, but wages nonetheless. The coupons could be exchanged for items at the camp canteen, toiletries, writing paper, even candy or cigarettes. One afternoon, a Japanese soldier stood outside the canteen, holding up a chocolate bar he had just purchased with his saved coupons. His hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the foil, the rich smell hitting him immediately. "In Japan," he murmured to a fellow prisoner standing beside him, "this is medicine. Something rare, precious. Here they give it away to soldiers like it is nothing." His friend shook his head slowly, disbelief written across his face. The canteen itself was another shock to the system. Prisoners watched American soldiers come and go throughout the day, chatting casually, buying Coke or chewing gum, joking with the clerk behind the counter. The casualness of it was almost unbearable. War was raging across Europe and the Pacific, cities burning, men dying by the thousands. Yet here in Wisconsin, Americans seemed to live as though abundance would never run dry, as though the war were some distant concept that didn't touch their daily lives. Still, the daily structure of camp life began to press down in a different way. There was no fighting here. No advancing through enemy territory. No dying comrades to bury in shallow graves. Instead, there was monotony. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. The mind, once consumed entirely by survival, now had space to wander. And with wandering came longing, deep, aching longing for home, for family, for the life that felt impossibly far away. Letters became lifelines. The camp allowed each prisoner to write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month, all heavily censored by American officials who blacked out anything deemed sensitive. But they were still precious, still a connection to the world beyond the wire. Men hunched over tables in the barracks, scratching out words with pencils, trying to capture their homes in ink, trying to say everything that mattered in a few short lines. "I am alive" was often all they could manage, the words feeling both inadequate and monumental. Some received letters back, thin envelopes with kanji written in familiar hands, the ink sometimes smudged from handling or water damage. Those men clutched the letters like treasures, reading them over and over until the paper grew soft and worn. Others received none. Week after week, they waited in line when mail was distributed, hoping to hear their name called, only to walk away empty-handed. For those men, silence grew heavier with each passing week, a weight that settled in their chests and made it hard to breathe. English classes were offered in the evenings, held in one of the larger barracks. A few curious prisoners attended, sitting on benches and repeating words slowly after the American teacher. Bread, table, window, thank you. The sounds felt strange in their mouths, foreign and awkward. Others scoffed at the classes, insisting there was no use in learning the enemy's tongue, that it was a form of surrender. But even the skeptics listened from their bunks, ears pricking at the strange rhythm of English words drifting through the walls. There were moments of unexpected contact, small exchanges that caught both sides off guard. A guard at a work site once asked a prisoner, through an interpreter, "Do you miss rice?" The question was simple, almost casual. The interpreter relayed it, and the prisoner laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. He answered in Japanese, his voice heavy with irony. "Rice is a memory now. We dream of it, but it does not come." When the reply was translated, the guard grew quiet, perhaps realizing the weight behind the words, the hunger embedded in that simple statement. Not all interactions were so gentle. Suspicion and resentment lingered on both sides. Some guards treated the prisoners with coldness, never speaking beyond the bare minimum of commands, their faces hard and unreadable. And within the barracks, arguments broke out among the prisoners themselves, voices rising in the night. Some clung fiercely to the idea that Japan would triumph, that these months of captivity would end in glorious victory, that they would return home as heroes despite their capture. Others, worn down by what they had seen, by the news trickling in from the outside world, muttered that defeat was inevitable. One night, two men argued so loudly that a guard had to intervene, banging on the door and shouting for silence. "You dishonor our homeland when you speak of defeat," one prisoner shouted, his face flushed with anger. "And you dishonor reason by denying what is before your eyes," the other snapped back, his voice breaking. The guards silenced them, but the tension remained, crackling in the air like static. Even in the middle of America, thousands of miles from the front lines, the war lived inside their minds, a constant presence that shaped every thought and conversation. Yet life in the camp also produced small, human routines that had nothing to do with war or politics. Prisoners carved wooden toys during free hours, their hands busy with knives and scraps of wood. They played improvised games with stones or sticks. They sat together in small groups, telling stories of home, of childhood, of festivals, of family dinners that felt like they belonged to another lifetime. The smell of the mess hall never ceased to haunt them, but at least it was steady. 3 meals a day, no matter what. That fact alone set this captivity apart from the jungle trenches and crumbling islands they had come from. In the barracks at night, silence often fell quickly after lights out. Exhaustion pulled men under fast. But every so often, someone whispered into the dark, their voice barely audible. "What do you think your family eats tonight?" The answers never came. Just sighs. The shifting of blankets. The quiet acknowledgement that some questions had no good answers. Daily life in Camp McCoy was not freedom. It was not cruelty either. It was something in between, a limbo where survival was certain but meaning felt elusive. The prisoners existed in a strange space, suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. But the longer they lived within the wire, the more they began to notice something even stranger. Behind the strict schedules and guarded fences, moments of connection began to flicker between captor and captive. Moments that could not be explained away by rules or routine. For weeks, the camp ran like clockwork. Guards gave orders. Prisoners followed. Meals came on schedule. The rhythm was predictable, even dull. But in between those routines, small cracks opened. Moments where humanity slipped through, unexpected and disarming. Moments that neither side could have imagined when the war began. It often started with the simplest thing: language. Few of the Japanese prisoners spoke English beyond a handful of words, and most Americans in the camp knew no Japanese at all. Commands were given through interpreters or gestures, a constant barrier that kept the two groups separate. Yet necessity pushed both sides to improvise. A guard might point at a shovel and bark, "Work." A prisoner, catching the sound and the gesture, would repeat it awkwardly under his breath, "Waku." Soon others did the same, laughing quietly at their own clumsy attempts, the absurdity of it breaking through the tension. One evening during an English class, the American instructor wrote the word family on the chalkboard in large, clear letters. He asked for a volunteer to say it aloud. A prisoner stood slowly, hesitated, then said carefully, "Famire." The class burst into laughter, not cruel, but genuine, the sound warm and human. Even the teacher smiled, nodding encouragement. The prisoner smiled too, his face softening for the first time in weeks. In that instant, the label of enemy gave way to something more ordinary. Men trying to bridge a gap, however small. Food, once again, became a kind of common ground. On rare occasions, guards shared cigarettes or chewing gum with prisoners during work details. The gum baffled them completely. One man chewed for a few minutes, then swallowed it whole, thinking it was meant to be eaten. The Americans roared with laughter, shaking their heads and trying desperately to explain through gestures that you weren't supposed to swallow it. Soon, gum became a small symbol of exchange. A guard offering a stick, a prisoner accepting it with a stiff bow, both sides acknowledging something unspoken. There were also clashes, moments when the weight of the war pressed too hard to ignore. On a farm outside the camp, where a group of POWs worked clearing fields, an American farmer watched them closely. His son had been killed in the Pacific months earlier, and resentment boiled in his stare, barely contained. When one prisoner bent to pick up a dropped tool, The farmer spat on the ground near his feet, the gesture sharp and deliberate. The guard escorting the work crew noticed immediately. He said nothing, but walked closer, positioning himself between the farmer and the prisoners. The tension hung in the cold air, unspoken but raw, heavy with grief and anger. The farmer turned away, muttering under his breath, "Should have left them to starve." That moment spread quickly among the prisoners when they returned to camp. "Not all Americans follow their rules," one said grimly, his voice flat. His bunkmate replied quietly, "Of course not. They are men like us. Some will hate. Some will not." Inside the wire, friendships sometimes grew where no one expected them. A young guard named Miller, barely 20 years old with a soft accent from Illinois, often lingered near the barracks after his duty ended. He carried photographs of his family in his wallet, creased, worn images of a smiling mother, a stern father, 2 small sisters with ribbons in their hair. He showed them to prisoners who gathered near the fence, curious despite themselves. They did not understand his words, but they understood the faces, the pride in his voice, the longing. In turn, prisoners traced shapes in the dirt with sticks, sketching their own homes, their villages, their wives waiting oceans away. It was not dialogue in words, but dialogue in images, in gestures, in the universal language of family. One evening, Miller managed to say slowly, pointing to the photos, "Mother, father, sisters." He gestured to himself, then to them. A prisoner nodded, touched his chest, and said in Japanese, "Haha. Chichi. Imato." The exchange lasted only moments before another guard ordered Miller away, but the seed was planted. They had spoken across the chasm, if only for an instant. Still, culture ran deep, and suspicion ran deeper. Among the Japanese prisoners, loyalty to the emperor was not erased by hamburgers or Coca-Cola or kind gestures. Some men whispered warnings against softening, against letting down their guard. They accused fellow prisoners who attended English classes of betraying their honor, of forgetting who they were. In the dim light of the barracks, arguments flared. Was survival worth adaptation? Or did every borrowed word, every moment of laughter with a guard, chip away at their identity, at everything they had been taught to value? One prisoner wrote secretly in his diary, the words cramped and small to save paper. "We were told Americans were animals. Yet they share their gum. They heal our wounds. Which is the lie? Which is the truth?" The contradictions gnawed at them. For some, the kindness of guards felt like humiliation, a reminder that they lived better as captives than their families did back home. For others, those same moments hinted at something uncomfortable but undeniable. The enemy was not faceless. The enemy laughed. The enemy missed his family. The enemy followed rules, even when it would have been easier not to. One snowy night, as lights flickered out across the camp and the wind howled against the barracks walls, a prisoner whispered to his bunkmate, "If we survive this war, what will we tell our children? That our enemy fed us? That he gave us blankets? That he smiled at us?" The bunkmate stayed silent for a long time, staring up at the dark ceiling. Finally, he answered softly, "We will tell them the truth, even if it shames us." But the truth was complicated. As the war dragged toward its bitter end, the contradictions inside Camp McCoy only grew heavier, pressing down on the prisoners until they were forced to face the hardest question of all. What did loyalty really mean when kindness came from the enemy? By the winter of 1945, the rhythms of Camp McCoy had settled into something the prisoners could not have imagined when they first stepped off that train. Hunger no longer carved their faces as sharply. Work, though tiring, did not break their bodies. They wrote letters home, some even daring to ask guards how to spell English words, their voices hesitant but curious. On the surface, life looked manageable, almost routine. Yet under that surface ran a deep conflict, one that grew sharper as weeks turned to months. How could they reconcile this treatment, this food, this warmth, this adherence to rules, with the hatred and loyalty they still carried in their hearts? How could they make sense of a world where the enemy fed them, better than their own nation had? Every night, debates flared in the barracks. Some argued fiercely that this was all deception, that America only pretended to treat prisoners well in order to weaken them, to steal their spirit before eventual repatriation. One man stood up one night, his voice harsh and trembling with anger. "Do not be fooled. Our emperor demands strength, not comfort. Every hamburger you swallow is a betrayal. Every smile you give is a surrender." Others, weary of suffering, pushed back. "We are alive," one countered, his voice quieter but no less firm. "And if survival is betrayal, Then what did dying hungry on Saipan achieve? What honor is there in a death no one remembers? Silence followed those words. Silence and shame, thick enough to choke on. Letters from home made the contradictions sting even sharper. When a prisoner received word that his family in Osaka survived on boiled weeds and scraps of barley, rationing every grain as though it were gold, he held the paper in shaking hands. The smell of roast beef drifted from the mess hall, carried on the winter wind, and the gulf between his life as a prisoner and theirs as civilians under bombing raids became unbearable. "I eat like a soldier," he confessed quietly to a bunkmate that night, his voice breaking, "while my children starve." It wasn't only food. Warmth itself became a symbol of guilt. In barracks heated by stoves, with wool blankets and steady boots on their feet, the men remembered family shivering back in wooden houses with windows shattered from air raids, with no fuel to burn, with nothing but thin cotton to keep out the cold. Captivity offered them safety, comfort, even small luxuries. Yet it deepened their guilt with every passing day. Some prisoners clung harder to propaganda, repeating it like prayers to ward off doubt. America was decadent, they insisted. Hollow, weak, ready to collapse under the weight of its own excesses. But the evidence around them mocked those words relentlessly. In the camp, Coca-Cola bottles arrived by the crate, stacked high in storage rooms. Cigarettes were available not just for soldiers, but for prisoners who had earned enough coupons. Work crews saw American farmers with tractors that did the labor of dozens of men, barns full of livestock, fields that seemed endless, stretching to the horizon. Abundance here was not fantasy or propaganda. It was normal. It was everyday life. One guard, overhearing a prisoner remark in broken English on the overflowing fields, said simply, almost casually, "This is only Wisconsin. You should see Illinois, or Iowa, or California." The prisoner lowered his eyes, ashamed of the envy burning in his chest, ashamed that he could feel anything but hatred for this place. The contradictions broke some men quietly, in ways that didn't show on the surface. One evening, a prisoner whispered through tears to his bunkmate, his voice barely audible, "I believed Japan was the center of the world, the greatest nation, the strongest. But now I see, perhaps we are only one small island." His bunkmate scolded him immediately, warned him never to speak such treason aloud, his voice sharp with fear. But the thought had been voiced, and thoughts, once spoken, cannot be taken back. Religion added another layer of complexity. Some prisoners gathered in hushed circles at night, reciting prayers to ancestors, clinging to tradition as though it were a lifeline. They burned small offerings when they could, whispered names of the dead, performed rituals that connected them to home. Others watched American chaplains lead services for their own men, Christian services with hymns and prayers in English, and curiosity flickered despite themselves. A few even attended, if only to sit in the warmth of the chapel, to escape the cold for an hour. They did not understand the hymns, could not follow the words, but they recognized the act of faith. Different gods, different rituals, but the same human hunger for hope, for meaning, for something larger than the war. Perhaps the most painful contradiction came during Red Cross inspections. Officials arrived regularly, walking through the barracks, checking conditions, asking questions through interpreters. "Are you being treated well? Are you receiving adequate food? Medical care? Have you been subjected to abuse?" Most prisoners answered yes, because it was true. The conditions were fair. The rules were followed. But afterward, in the barracks, shame swept over them like a wave. "We admit our enemy treats us fairly," one man said bitterly, staring at the floor, "while our own nation cannot feed us. What does that make us?" No one had an answer. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable, broken only by the wind rattling the windows. One snowy afternoon, a work crew was clearing a road outside the camp when a group of American children approached. They were curious, bold in the way only children can be, their cheeks red from the cold, breath misting in the air. One girl, no more than 8 or 9, held out a candy bar through the wire fence, offering it to a Japanese prisoner. Her smile was innocent, uncomplicated by war or politics. The prisoner froze. He had faced bombs and bullets. He had endured hunger that gnawed at his sanity. But the innocent gesture of a child terrified him more than any weapon ever had. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took the candy bar. He bowed low, deeper than necessary, and said in halting, broken English, "Thank you." The girl smiled wider, pleased with herself, then skipped back to her friends, laughing. That night, The man confessed to his bunkmates that he felt more broken by that small kindness than by all the battles he had endured. "A child of the enemy," he whispered, his voice thick with confusion and pain, "gave me food with a smile. How can I hate her? How can I hate any of them when they do this?" Such moments left scars of confusion, deep and lasting. They did not erase loyalty to the emperor. They did not end the war inside their hearts. But they made the line between friend and foe blurrier than propaganda ever admitted, blurrier than their training had prepared them for. As 1945 pressed on, the men knew the war outside was reaching its climax. Rumors trickled into camp, whispers of massive bombings in Tokyo, of losses in the Philippines, of American forces closing in on the home islands. Each new report widened the contradiction inside the barbed wire. They lived with steady meals, shelter, even glimpses of humanity. Outside, their nation burned. But captivity, no matter how humane, could not last forever. The question looming ahead was simple and terrifying. What would happen when the gates finally opened and they returned to a homeland scarred by fire and hunger? By the summer of 1945, the world outside Camp McCoy had shifted beyond recognition. Whispers turned to headlines, carried in American newspapers that prisoners occasionally glimpsed through. Guards or Red Cross officials who left them lying around. The Allies were advancing rapidly in Europe. Germany had fallen. Cities in Japan were burning under waves of B-29 bombers, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash in a single night. When the news came of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, rumors raced through the camp faster than guards could silence them. Most prisoners did not fully understand what an atomic bomb was. The concept was beyond anything they had encountered before. But the horror of it bled through every word, every whispered description. 2 cities. Gone. Vaporized in an instant. Then came the truth they could not ignore. The truth that landed like a physical blow. Japan had surrendered. The announcement fell over Camp McCoy like a weight no one could lift. Some prisoners stared blankly at the ground, faces empty of expression, minds struggling to process what they had just heard. Others wept in silence, shoulders shaking under thin blankets, tears streaming down faces they tried desperately to hide. For years, they had carried the belief that their nation could not fall, that death was preferable to defeat. Now defeat had arrived while they were behind barbed wire, unable to lift a weapon, unable to choose their fate, unable to do anything but survive. Days passed in a strange, hollow quiet. The guards did not gloat. They did not celebrate in front of the prisoners or taunt them with their victory. They simply carried on with the routines, meals, roll calls, inspections, work details. For many prisoners, that steadiness was unbearable. "They treat us the same," one man whispered bitterly, his voice raw. "Whether we are warriors or defeated, it makes no difference to them. Do they not see our shame? Do they not understand what this means?" But the camp was already preparing for repatriation. The Red Cross began organizing lists, transportation routes, schedules. Prisoners were given clean uniforms, fresh medical checkups to ensure they were fit for travel, and briefings about the journey ahead. They would be shipped back across the Pacific, back to Japan, not as soldiers of a victorious empire, but as survivors of a war their nation had lost. The weight of that reality pressed down harder with each passing day. The departure was not triumphant. There were no celebrations, no flags, no songs of victory. On the morning of the transfer, the prisoners filed out of their barracks carrying small bundles of belongings. Some clutched wooden carvings they had made during idle hours, toys for children they hadn't seen in years, small gifts to prove they had been alive, that they had thought of home. Others carried carefully folded letters from family, stained with tears and sweat, creased from being read over and over until the paper grew soft. As they passed through the gates of Camp McCoy for the last time, many glanced back. It was not fondness that moved them, not gratitude in any simple sense. It was confusion. The place where they had expected cruelty had instead given them hamburgers, Coca-Cola, blankets, medical care, and even glimpses of kindness. The contradiction was almost too much to bear. How do you hate a place that kept you alive? How do you reconcile the enemy's humanity with everything you were taught? The journey home was long and heavy. On the ship, men huddled together in tight groups, speaking in low voices, wondering what awaited them in Japan. Cities were gone, reduced to rubble and ash. Families were scattered, displaced, struggling to survive. Hunger was worse than when they had left, rations cut to almost nothing. They worried about being branded cowards, despised for having lived as prisoners when honor demanded they die fighting. The guilt was sharp, cutting deep. But so was another memory, one they could not forget no matter how hard they tried. The taste of that first meal in Camp McCoy. One man, scribbling in a worn notebook with a stubby pencil, wrote carefully, "I thought my enemy would break me with violence. Instead, he broke me with food. I cannot erase the taste of bread, meat, and sweetness. It will follow me home like a shadow." When the prisoners finally stepped onto Japanese soil, reality struck hard and fast. Bombed ruins stretched where cities once stood, skeletal remains of buildings jutting up like broken teeth. Families met them with tears, relief and joy mixed with bitterness and confusion. Some wives and children had survived on grass and tree bark, boiling leather to make soup, chewing on anything that might offer a few calories. Others had not survived at all. Empty spaces at the table. Names that would never be spoken again. The returning prisoners faced accusations almost immediately. Whispers followed them through the streets. "Coward. Weakling. You should have died with honor." Some families embraced their returning sons and husbands with love, grateful beyond words to have them back alive. Others turned cold, unable to reconcile the shame of capture with the relief of survival. The prisoners carried stories no one at home wanted to hear. Stories of hamburgers and Coca-Cola, of Americans who treated them by rules instead of rage, of an enemy who was not the monster they had been promised. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt from the ashes, a few spoke cautiously about their time in America. They admitted, in quiet conversations over tea or late at night when the streets were empty, that captivity had forced them to see the enemy not as monsters but as men. They spoke of guards who shared cigarettes, of medics who healed wounds, of children who offered candy with innocent smiles. Others never spoke at all, burying the memories under layers of duty and shame, locking them away where no one could see. Yet even in silence, the contradictions lived on. The legacy of Camp McCoy and other camps like it is not found in battles or grand victories. It is found in those quiet, disorienting moments when food, kindness, and order collided with fear and loyalty. For the prisoners, captivity revealed something uncomfortable but undeniable. Humanity could exist even in the middle of war, even between enemies, even when it made no sense. And perhaps that is the final lesson, the truth that outlasts the noise of cannons and the smoke of battlefields. Wars end. Nations rise and fall. Empires crumble into dust. But the small choices, a guard sharing a photograph, a child offering candy, a cook sliding a hamburger across a counter, can leave marks that outlast everything else. For those Japanese prisoners, the taste of Coca-Cola and the grease of a hamburger became symbols of contradiction, yes, but also of survival, of the strange, complicated truth that even enemies can show mercy. And sometimes, mercy cuts deeper than hatred ever could. As one prisoner told his son years later, his voice quiet and heavy with memory, "I learned in America that kindness is harder to carry than cruelty. Cruelty you can fight. You can hate it. You can. Use it to fuel your anger. But kindness? Kindness you remember. It stays with you. It changes you in ways you cannot undo." He paused, staring out the window at the rebuilt streets of Tokyo, at the neon signs and bustling crowds, at a nation reborn from ashes. War can strip men of everything, their homes, their honor, their lives. But it cannot erase the power of small acts of humanity. And that, he said softly, is the story worth remembering. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more true accounts of World War II history. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today. They remind us of the choices humans make in the darkest hours. Choices that reveal who we really are. Not just as soldiers or enemies, but as people. And sometimes, that's the most important story of all.